Friday, the 24th of February 2023, marked 1 year of the Russia-Ukraine war. What started as a special military operation by Russia to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine and escalated into a full-blown war causing massive devastation is still raging 365 days later with no end in sight. In fact, a year later, both sides appear to be more entrenched than ever to continue to fight for victory at any cost. Neither side is ready to negotiate, nor has there been any breakthrough that would change the course of the war. And as the stalemate continues, the world remains deeply divided, battling economic, social, and humanitarian consequences of the war. The United Nations says more than 13 million people have been displaced since the invasion. Tens of thousands of lives have been lost on both sides, multiple cities reduced to ruins, with a massive economic cost of damage to both warring sides. Now, as the conflict drags into another year, we ask what lies ahead. That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tina Jha. To talk about the Russia-Ukraine war a year later, its implications and where is it heading, we have with us three distinguished panelists joining us with their perspectives on the program. Pleased to welcome with me on the program Mr. Dmitry Babych. He's political analyst at Inosmi Internet Project, Russia. Ms. Annie Peters, Director, Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, Heidelberg, Germany. And Mr. Pankaj Sarun, former ambassador to Russia. He's also served as the Deputy National Security Advisor, Government of India, and he's currently the convener of NatStrat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today. Ambassador Sarun, let me begin the program today with you. How do you evaluate the last 1 year? The war, of course, has had tragic consequences for not just the warring sides, but the rest of the world as well. And where do you think it is heading now?
Thank you very much, firstly, for having me on the show. I think we have witnessed a very tragic and regrettable episode in European security affairs in the last 1 year. And for countries like India, which belong to the global south, we cannot help but recall the terrible days of the Cold War and subsequent years, because all the issues which plagued those many decades seem to have resurfaced back again last year. And this is just when the entire world, and including India, we were all recovering from the pandemic. So it's actually very, very unfortunate, not just for Europe and Russia, but also for countries outside the region, far away from the region, such as India.
Particularly, and consequences not favorable to other parts of the world as well that had no doing in the war but are now suffering the most because of it. We'll come back and continue the discussion on what really needs to be done. How can the world come together to find solutions to at least, have a breakthrough? But Mr. Babych, let me come to you for your perspective. What's important to understand here that it started as a special military operation. That's what the Russian president announced. 1 year of the war and no end in sight. Help us and our viewers get a sense of what impact has it had on Russia, because war is a tragedy that has devastating consequences for everyone. So take us through how it has impacted Russia.
You are absolutely right that the war had an impact, a negative impact on everyone, even on people or countries which in the short run could get some benefits from the war. In the long run, I think it's a tragedy for everyone. But I would not completely agree that it started exactly a year ago as a special military operation. In fact, it started in 2014 when the legally elected president in Ukraine was ousted by violent insurrection. Let me remind you, very few people know it in the West, but 38 policemen were killed to death during these so-called Maidan protests. They were called peaceful protests by the West, but it was absolutely wrong. And hundreds of policemen were maimed. So it was a real coup d'etat, which actually led to a prolonged civil war in Ukraine between the east of the country and the capital, Kiev, in which at least 14,000 people died. Of course, a military confrontation in which 14,000 people die is not some kind of a peaceful situation, it's a war. So I think President Putin miscalculated. He thought that he could resolve the problem in the same way Americans did it in the Persian Gulf, by sending a relatively small expeditionary force, just about 120,000 men, which is not enough for a country of almost 40 million. He miscalculated, and this miscalculation had tragic consequences. However, I would disagree with the predominant view in the West that it was his intention, to devastate Ukraine and to have so many human losses. In fact, even if you listen to President Zelensky's, the Ukrainian president's former advisor, Alexei Arestovich, who is by no means a friend of Russia, he admitted recently that in the first 5 days, Russia did not use heavy weapons because Russians expected that they would not meet so much resistance in Ukraine. So there were two surprises in this war. First, the strength of the Ukrainian resistance and the amount of arms which the West sent to Ukraine, lethal arms, which had been arriving even before February 22nd. And the second surprise is that the Russian economy, with some help, I think, from China and from Global South, has been able to sustain 10 packages of Western sanctions. The 10th package is coming right now. I live in Moscow and I'm a middle-income person, and I can tell you that there were no dramatic consequences from the so-called exit of Western companies from Russia. Of course,
you're right, Mr. Babic. Of course, there's a history to how the conflict started. But Ms. Peters, what at this point in time we are concerned about is the present and the future. Given that both sides appear to be more entrenched than ever, we saw the US president visiting Ukraine. We've heard the Russian president speak a few days before the first anniversary of the war. It seems neither side is, willing to negotiate, talk about peace. Given the current situation, is Europe, set to brace for, the situation which is slowly turning from bad to worse?
Yeah. Thank you for this question. I would like to refer to the United Nations. The General Assembly, which is the plenary organ, has also issued a resolution at the occasion of the one-year war. And in the resolution of 23rd February of this year, the General Assembly, with a majority of 141 votes, underscored the need to reach comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine under respect of the principles of sovereign equality and the territorial integrity of states. This means that the General Assembly, the voice of the international community, supports Ukraine, its territorial integrity, and it has before, as we know, condemned the unlawful use of force and the aggravated form of aggression committed by Russia against Ukraine. So it is, in a way, it is of course a tragic situation, but we use the word tragedy for something where there is a no choice situation, but there is an easy choice. Russia could stop this aggressive war.
All right, Ambassador, so, in this blame game between Russia, Ukraine and the West about initiating the war, then prolonging it, it's been 1 year. The question is, where is the United Nations?
Well, I think one of the most important lessons from this conflict, and starting from 2014 actually, is the complete failure of the United Nations to either prevent or to resolve the problems that we face today in Europe. And the United Nations has been singularly ineffective and incapable. And we do not see any sense of urgency from the United Nations or any credible actions or diplomatic efforts, except for the presence of the UN during the grain deal in the middle of last year. But on the Indian point of view, that the United Nations is ineffective and needs reform has actually been completely justified by what we have actually witnessed. And With all due respect, I mean, General Assembly resolutions, unfortunately, do not count for much. I mean,
Right.
if they were so significant, by now Palestine would have been an independent country. So, there are resolutions after resolutions, and we cannot either have double standards on global issues, or we cannot have a United Nations that is completely paralyzed. And therefore, we need reform. We need different voices, because today what we find is that the biggest military and economic powers are locked in a battle. And all of us in the global south, we are just simply watching helplessly this replay of Cold War issues about sovereignty and security and everything else. And it has actually, in a sense, brought the world to a dead halt. We are bystanders and spectators to a spectacle which we are not interested in. We did not want it. For us, there are many more critical issues facing our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely, you're right. The irony is, Ambassador, and this External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has often spoken about, that the global south had no role in what led to the war, but the implications have perhaps been the most on these countries, which are the most vulnerable, and they find no representation at any of these multilateral institutions. So now that India is, has taken over the G20 presidency, we are hopeful that some of these issues and challenges will be addressed, provided there is consensus among the leaders. Mr. Babich, the question is now, because of course no side is willing to talk peace, and we are seeing that this war is going on, both sides are unrelenting. The question is also about, for how long will both sides be able to sustain? Ukraine, of course, is getting a lot of military aid from the West. There's been a new package that's been announced by the G7, by the United States. For Russia also, how difficult is it to sustain the war?
Of course, it is difficult to sustain the war, not so much materially as morally. Again, this is not reported in the West, but millions of people from Ukraine have been coming as refugees to Russia, not only during the last year, when more than 1 million came, but also before, during all of these 8 years, when Eastern Ukraine was bombed and bombarded by the Ukrainian army. And a lot of people left Ukraine simply because they didn't want to live with the regime that came to power by violence. So indeed, you might know that all Ukrainians speak Russian, a lot of them, as well as us, Russians sometimes better. We can't tell Ukrainians from us. So this is not noticeable on the streets of Moscow, that we have so many refugees from Ukraine, because they're indistinguishable from us. Unlike people from Uzbekistan or from other Central Asian republics who also come in millions, these people are not noticeable. They just mingle into our society. We give them our homes because we feel that they are us. They're not even brothers, they are us. But you raised a very important issue about the United Nations. I just wanted to say very quickly that the United Nations had its authority undermined primarily during the Iraqi war, during the attack of NATO against Yugoslavia in 1999. Let me remind you that these military actions were taken without the consent of the Security Council of the United Nations and without a general vote. I agree with the ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, that unfortunately the global south is a bystander in the United Nations, but I don't think it's great powers fighting inside. It's actually the West, the United States and the EU, because of their economic power, they control the United Nations. And if you look at the recent vote on the 23rd of February, yes, it was an anti-Russian vote, but if you look which parts of the world represented these 142 votes for Ukraine, they did not include India, they did not include China, they actually did not include the majority of humanity. And of course, this vote was not honest because, I was to Serbia recently, I was in Hungary. Formally, these countries voted for this resolution, but in Serbia, I saw demonstrations in support of Russia's policy. And I know that the government of Serbia was pressured to show some kind of opposition to Russia. In fact, I interviewed the Serb president, Mr. Vucic. He is not anti-Russian. He certainly sees how complicated this issue is. Again, I, just like President Vucic, I don't want to whitewash the Russian side in this conflict. I think President Putin made a lot of mistakes. The first one was to allow this military coup in Ukraine to happen in 2014, when the Western countries sent their government members to Kiev to cheerlead and support the protesters. Russia did not send anyone, and the illegal seizure of power happened. By the way, during this illegal seizure of power, the Ukrainian rebels, the opposition, they disregarded the guarantees given by the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Poland that there would be end of violence and a fresh new election. So, in fact, France, Germany, and Poland, and the European Union at large, they compromised themselves many times. They cannot be viewed as honest intermediaries in this conflict, which is very unfortunate.
Okay, Ms. Peters, you wanted to add something on the United States. You wanted to talk about the.
I will tell you something interesting in the end.
Sure, Mr. Babic, I'll come back to you in just a moment. Since we are talking about the relevance of the United Nations, how the credibility, the trust of these global institutions is being impacted. 1 year of the war, the consequences are for everyone to see, and the United Nations clearly is missing. Ms. Peters, your take on, of course, how will these institutions continue to make themselves relevant amid the worsening scenario and the geopolitical alignment? And the other aspect being on the impact on Europe. We all know how Europe has been besieged by this huge conflict, perhaps the largest since the Second World War. So, of course, it's for everyone's good and more so in the interest of Europe to work towards a peace plan and to ensure that the war ends as soon as possible. Ms. Peters, am I audible to you? We seem to have lost connection with Ms. Peters. We'll try and reconnect. But Ambassador, the same question again, the fact that in the initial days, and since you spoke about the resolutions of the United Nations, India abstaining became a major point of criticism. Today, we see there's, of course, been a change of stance. There is increasing international recognition of India's independent stance as well. So German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is currently here in India as we speak. And while, speaking to the media today, he did express hope that under India's G20 presidency, the world actually is looking towards India to negotiate, come up with a peace plan and perhaps help end the war, and also to find some solutions to the other persisting global challenges.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, our abstention in the United Nations was absolutely of no surprise. It is fully in conformity with our approach to the conflict from day one. On the G20 and the visit of the German Chancellor and our relationships with all parties, the fact is that India today has very substantive relationships with all parties to this conflict, starting from the United States, Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. And we are proud of those partnerships, and we want to pursue those partnerships. And we believe that the current situation in the world demands a true interactive and a normal interstate relationship among all nations. The Indian motto is that the world is a family, and we mean it. And therefore, during the G20 presidency, we will ensure, or at least try to ensure, that political and security issues do not interfere with the agenda of the G20, and that the G20 priorities, whether it is economic or trade or debt or climate, these continue to remain the focus of the G20. So this is, in fact, I think a position that India has very emphatically taken. And I think it's an excellent position that we have taken. And at the same time, we have, of course, also been equally firm in repeatedly asserting the need for a return to negotiation and diplomacy and to prevent further escalation on the battlefield.
Mr. Babich, yes, there was an interesting aspect that you wanted to share with us. Please go on. And the other aspect being about the role that India can perhaps play, because peace is in everyone's interest. The implications and the negative consequences that Russia also is facing as a result of the war in the wake of multiple sanctions that have been imposed on the country. So it's all going to be good if we talk peace. So what role can India play which can be beneficial for all parties?
Yes, I wanted to say, you mentioned Europe. Yes, this is exactly what I wanted to say. Unfortunately, after the Ukrainian rebels in 2014 completely disregarded the guarantees given to President Yanukovych and the Ukrainian opposition by the representatives of the European countries, France, Germany, Poland, unfortunately, Europe lost the ability to be the intermediary in this conflict. It is clear that the European Union and the vast majority of individual European countries, they're on the side of the regime in Kiev. They cannot be honest brokers. And we have seen it during these 8 years. In 2015, the so-called Minsk agreements were signed, which were supposed to put an end to the conflict on the basis of certain autonomy for the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine in the east, exactly the ones Russian army is trying to protect now. Unfortunately, this, the fact that Europe lost the ability to be the intermediary, I think it opens huge opportunities for other countries. Turkey was an excellent intermediary, and last year in March 2022, Russia and Ukraine almost reached a peace agreement in Istanbul. Unfortunately, it was the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who came to Kiev and who dissuaded President Zelensky from approving and signing these peace agreements. Johnson and the US President Biden, they started pushing for the Ukrainian victory, which is impossible because Ukrainian victory, in their understanding, means that Ukraine would seize back Crimea. Crimea is a peninsula which Russia can easily defend and which is populated by 2 million people, most of them ethnic Russians, who had been living in Russia now for 8 years. And of course, these people do not want to return to Ukraine, I can assure you. So basically, India could play a role of a mediator in this conflict because both Ukraine respect India. They understand that this is an independent country, huge country, which can pursue its policies without looking up to Washington or to any other country. Already we had a peace initiative from Beijing, from China, 12 points. Unfortunately, it was very badly received by the West. The West rejected it outright because the United States is so hostile to China.
Let me get the ambassador's response to why the West is skeptical on China's peace plan, Ambassador. That's the first part of the question. The second part also being on whether there are diplomatic talks already underway, whether India is already making efforts, because amid the expectations, what we saw last year, there was, of course, criticism to India's position and strategy on the Ukraine war. That now shifting to acceptance, to expectations, and the Prime Minister reciprocating today during talks with the German Chancellor that India has always been on the side of peace, dialogue, diplomacy. We are ready to play a bigger role. So that leads us to this situation, whether we would like you to help us better understand whether diplomatic talks are already underway, whether India is already playing an increasing role between Ukraine and Russia, because we share good relations with all parties, in establishing peace for the larger good?
Yeah, I think India has done whatever it could in the last 1 year in terms of talking publicly and privately to all sides and emphasizing and underlining that peace, negotiation and diplomacy must be pursued to find a solution which is acceptable and sustainable,
Right.
and for all sides. That's the first point. Secondly, when you get into a role of either mediating or facilitating or whichever word that you want to use, you also have to make an assessment whether there is willingness on the part of the parties to find a solution and whether the situation is ripe for you to play a role. It is difficult to succeed when there is no political willingness on either side for finding a solution outside of a military solution. So I think the assessment India has made is that we will continue to persevere in our diplomatic efforts. We will continue to persevere in voicing the views and opinion of the global South. And we will continue to talk to all sides, and which is what we have done today also with the German Chancellor. We've done it in Moscow, we've done it in Washington, we've done it in other European capitals. And I think for the moment, that is perhaps all that we can do.
Right.
The success of these efforts depends on the willingness of the parties to find a solution.
Clearly, and all we can hope for is that a solution comes at the earliest, because it is in the benefit for the larger, aspect of humanity, of course. Because if the war ends, we can then channelize our energies towards rebuilding and towards other pressing challenges like climate change. So that having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you, Ambassador and Mr. Babich, for joining us on this edition of the Global Debate, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time. I'll see you same time next week now. Take good care of yourselves. Have a good weekend.